Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Dominique Gomez from the Salazar Center for North American Conservation at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar series, Connecting for Conservation. Today, we're going to be talking about building community trust and understanding the people that you're working with. We have two wonderful panelists that I'm going to be introducing in just one moment. First, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to let you know that you are on mute, so we can't hear you, but we would love to hear from you. We will be doing a moderated discussion at the end of our session today, and so please submit your questions throughout the time and throughout the presentations from our panelists through that GoToWebinar control panel at the question box. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can, and we want to hear from you certainly. This session is being recorded. We know many people might have to jump off or would like to share what we talk about today with their colleagues. We will share the recording within the next few days. So just look for an email from us and we will share a link to that. You can learn more about the Salazar Center at salazarcenter.colorado.state.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Here at the Salazar Center, we work on supporting and advancing the health and connectivity of natural systems and landscapes throughout North America. And we know that healthy natural systems support climate adaptation and resilience, protect biodiversity, and support long-term human health. And our intersectional approach builds bridges to connect academic research, community practice, and policy development. Again, learn more about us on our website. This webinar is part of our Connecting for Conservation web series, and we've been very excited to explore different topics throughout the year, everything from climate adaptation and resilience, indigenous practices and leadership, and we'll be talking more about health equity, biodiversity, soil health, private land conservation, and other topics in the coming weeks. You can stay tuned for all of those webinars by making sure you're signed up for our newsletter on our website. And we will also talk a little bit about an upcoming webinar at the end of our time today. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist. Today we have Robert Bonney, who is the Executive in Residence at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. And Robert, before he joined the Nicholas Institute, was at the second term of the Obama administration, was the Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. During President Obama's first term, Robert served as senior advisor to Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack for Environment and Climate Change. And prior to joining the USDA, Robert was Vice President for Land Conservation for the Environmental Defense Fund. Robert has master's degrees in forestry and environmental management from Duke University. He grew up on a farm in Kentucky and now lives in Virginia. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks for having me. And I hope everybody is safe and well in these challenging times. So I want to talk today about rural attitudes on the environment. And this is work I've recently done with colleagues at Duke and elsewhere that I'll mention a little bit later. But it's an issue that I've been interested in my entire career. At USDA, obviously, doing a lot of work with rural stakeholders in agriculture and forestry and rural communities. But as well, before that, when I was at Environmental Defense Fund, I spent a lot of time with rural stakeholder groups. And I've always been interested in what I perceived to be at the time a divide on environmental issues. I always had a sense that rural folks had a deep commitment to stewardship, but that there were also concerns about environmental policy. So when I left the administration in 2017, went to Duke, started to work on this topic, and I'll give you the results of a couple-year effort of me and my colleagues at Duke today. So let me start off just by talking about why rural matters. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but obviously if you look at political maps today, red versus blue, you know that rural voters behave differently than other parts of the country. And rural voters obviously matter for a lot of the issues we care about. if you're interested in conservation and the environment, then you really need to be interested in what happens on rural lands. Obviously, most of the country is rural, but most of the land is in private ownership, and those private owners have important implications for water, wildlife, climate, you name it. But even in places where there are a large public land base, rural communities matter and rural voices matter to the management of those lands. Also, this is true at USDA, but it's true at other places as well. You have agencies that have a big presence in rural, and a lot of their staff are rural, and that's an important consideration as well. And then if you think about environmental policy, there's a little thing back in Washington we like to call the United States Senate, and it is designed to empower rural parts of the country and rural constituencies. And so if you want to pass climate legislation, if you want to update the Endangered Species Act, if you're interested in environmental policy, you need to care about what rural people care about. So just quickly on what we did, my colleagues at Duke, Emily Petcher, who's now at the University of Rhode Island, Elizabeth Rowe, a master's student at Duke, worked with Jay Campbell from Hart Research, Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategy, and Drew Bennett at University of Wyoming. We did a series of focus groups across the country, many in the West, but in other parts of the country as well. We did a national telephone poll of 1,600 voters, 1,000 of whom were rural. We polled on agriculture and climate in the upper Midwest. We did a poll and some focus groups in Wyoming around wildlife migration. And then we interviewed rural leaders across the country in agriculture, forestry, tribal leaders, African-American landowners. We tried to capture the diversity of rural stakeholders. And I should say, rural is a diverse. There's a lot of diversity in rural, and I think we tried to carry out focus groups, polling, and our interviews in a way that captured that diversity. So there is an urban-rural divide on the environment. That probably won't surprise many of you, but it's not a function of how much people care about the environment. In focus groups, we found again and again, even before we told rural focus group participants that we were there to talk to them about the environment and conservation, when we asked them what was important about living in rural, people automatically talked about open space and clean water and clean air and the outdoors, and it's the importance of rural outdoors, of the environment and conservation was clear in all the focus groups that we did across the country. And the same was true in the polling we did. And here you see a slide that shows results from our national poll, where we just asked people how important environment and conservation issues were to you personally. If you correct for party, there's basically no difference across urban, suburban, and rural voters. Basically, everybody cares about the same for the environment. So the divide isn't characterized by how much people care about the environment. The divide also isn't driven by economic concerns. You know, you'd think, particularly in places like the West, where you've had debates about spotted owls and public land management, oil and gas, but in other parts of the country as well, that maybe it's that people care about the environment, but they're concerned about the economic trade-offs. Again, in focus groups, we found that rural folks again and again talked about the importance of protecting the environment for the economy, for agriculture, for the outdoor recreation business, for forestry and other things. And that came through in the polling as well. You see here that really across the board, rural voters, when asked if protection of the environment should be given priority, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, is clearly there's a strong preference for putting the environment first. We also wondered if maybe the urban-rural divide was a function of how people understood the issues or the science around issues. And we found in focus groups that rural voters were actually quite sophisticated about the issues. So it wasn't a question of a lack of understanding or just a different view of how environmental issues were presented. It really, again, we found that many of these voters are actually quite sophisticated on the issues. The fundamental driver of the divide that we found both in focus groups and in polling was attitudes towards the government. In focus groups, there was oftentimes a similar pattern, which is we'd open the focus group, talk about what it meant to be rural, and you would hear people really talking about the importance of the environment. The minute you started talking about policy, particularly federal policy, you could feel everybody in the focus group begin to tap on the brakes. And that came through in the polling as well. And you see, we asked everybody what their preferred level of government oversight over environment and conservation issues, and whether they wanted much more oversight, much less oversight, or about the same. You'll see that folks ask, are rural voters and urban suburban voters behave differently? Those who support more oversight are less prevalent in rural and more prevalent in urban and suburban. And the important thing is this is not just a function of party. It's true, rural Democrats behave differently than urban, likewise for independents and Republicans. And if you look at groups that you might think would be strong on or supportive of environmental and conservation policy, for example, voters age 18 to 34, voters with post-grad education, voters who say in the poll that the environment is very important. Again, you see this dampening effect for voters in rural parts of the country. And so a fundamental driver of the urban-rural divide is attitudes towards the government, and particularly the federal government. Because of that, there are a lot of rural voters who very much see themselves as pro-environment, but they're very skeptical about the government. And we asked, in one focus group, we asked folks about the Clean Water Act and the current controversy around the Clean Water Act and the so-called Waters of the U.S. rule that basically describes the extent or the reach of the act. We teed up the issue in an unbiased way for them and then asked them their opinion. And here you have a rural Arizona voter that says, I have mixed feelings because it could be good for water conservation, but maybe bad for the development of housing and farming, which we need in order to live. Likewise, an Idaho voter saying, I have concerns about the government's ability to design a program with enough flexibility to accommodate situations already in play. Again, pretty sophisticated views of the issue, whether you agree with their views on the policy or not, but very much a sense that these voters view themselves as pro-environment, but very skeptical about the government. We were interested in attitudes towards state and federal government, and in the focus groups we found again and again a preference for state and local government. And we asked, in the national poll, we asked the same question, and for half of the poll participants, we framed one rationale for the federal government, that the federal government should take the lead because it has the most resources and is the highest level of government. And for the other half of the poll, we asked a different formulation, that the federal government should take the lead because many rivers and forests cross state boundaries and need national oversight. And you'll see that in both cases, there's strong preference for state government. But the most interesting thing to me about this slide is actually where the urban and suburban voters are. There's a strong preference for state government there as well. And in focus groups and in other polling, we found that people tend to emphasize the importance of state government in environmental and conservation issues. We were interested in who rural voters trust, and so in focus groups and in the polling, we gave voters a list and asked them to pick the top two folks that they trusted. Again and again in focus groups and in polling, farmers and ranchers at the top of the list. If you add in forest landowners, same thing, top of the list. You know, there's a sense you hear people talk about sort of the rejection of science or elites in rural. We didn't find that at all. We found actually a real interest in hearing from biologists and scientists at either state universities or other universities, and and so there's a real acceptance of the importance of that type of information. What was interesting is when we asked people where to get that information, they didn't know where to get it. And so there was a gap. There was an interest in that information, but not knowing where to get it. You might think, well, I just got through telling you how everybody rejects the government. Why do government agencies score highly in trust? And I think that's because rural voters are making a differentiation between experts in the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Forest Service or their state natural resource agencies and the sort of regulatory bodies that they think about back in Washington, D.C. This chart isn't a function of who they don't trust. It's, again, we asked, who do you trust? But note that conservation and environmental groups are ranked well below others. We also were interested in what kind of messages that would appeal to rural voters. And this is as much, I think, a window into how, into rural values. And I think that's why it's interesting. Messages about moral responsibility, protecting things for future generations score very well. Clean water is popular as well. There's a sense of a concern about the need to regulate corporations. So even as there is this skepticism about federal regulation in particular, there's also a sense in all the focus groups as well as polling that actually, regulations are necessary, and that without it, there may be some challenges with particularly corporations. So a little bit on climate. So we asked folks about the climate, but we always save climate to the end because in polling and focus groups, because we found it was quite polarizing. And we opened the poll by asking about weather. And here we asked, without referring to climate, have you experienced weather changes such as increased hurricanes, flooding, droughts, fires, that sort of thing? Interesting thing here is that the people's views of the weather are polarized across party, polarized across urban and rural voters. And I think in part that's because people know what you're asking these days. You're not just asking about the weather, you're asking about climate change. And when we asked how important it is the United States take action to reduce climate change, here you see rural voters about 15 points lower than urban and suburban voters. On the one hand, you might say, well, that's a significant split, but you might also say, well, look, 54%, if you're in favor of passing climate legislations, that's pretty good. I would say, I would urge a little bit of caution, just because that people's attitudes towards government, I think, act as a bit of a kill switch. That is, if you talk to rural voters about and key into their skepticism about the government, I think there may be more concerns about taking action to reduce climate change. So I'd look at 54%, at least in our polling, as a high watermark. And one of the things we were interested in is, what's the relationship between people's views on the government and climate change? It turns out there's a very strong relationship with how people view the government and how they view action on climate change. This is one agricultural leader from the state of North Dakota who says, I'm going to sit here and tell you that the climate is very different than when my dad was farming. But we're all hesitant to say that because they're afraid of the policy consequences once everybody admits it. We found that not only was climate polarizing, but even with folks that saw that not only the climate was changing, but that humans were driving it, then a lot of rural communities are reticent to talk about it because it is polarizing. So let me just go through a few implications, and then I'll hand it back. So I think most importantly, there's no simple fix here. This is not a messaging problem. Even though I put up a messaging slide for you, this is not a thing that's going to be fixed with better talking points. It's key that we're going to have to engage with rural stakeholders, that the type of work that's already going on in a lot of places to engage those stakeholders, to work with them, to look for opportunities for collaboration is going to be really, really important. And I think in addition to that, rethinking some policy. Are there ways to look at more collaborative approaches? Are there ways to engage state and local government in policy. I'm not suggesting that command and control or regulatory approaches don't have a place. They clearly do. But it's also clear that we need to think about a broader set of toolboxes or a broader set of tools in the toolbox if we're going to reach rural. The last thing I'd say is that I think there are reasons for optimism. We found a real interest in those stakeholder leaders with actually engaging to wanting to be at the table to work on these issues. There's a deep sense of stewardship and desire to protect the environment in rural, a sense that willing to curb economic growth to protect the environment, and I think that's reasons for optimism. But I think we need to engage, rethink policy, and that's going to take time. This is the report. Happy to take questions. You can get the copy of the report downloaded on the Nicholas Institute website. We've got a couple more things coming. One on we're going to do a deeper dive on climate change, as well as a deeper dive on rural attitudes in the West. So with that, let me hand it back.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was just a great start to the conversation. And I do want to let people know that if you are interested in this topic of communicating with rural communities, in partnership with the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the Wilberforce Foundation, the Salazar Center will actually be featuring Robert Bunny again, as well as some other researchers in a workshop in September 16th, talking about communicating and working in rural communities. It will likely be virtual, still to be determined exactly, but we will be certainly sending more information, so make sure you're on our mailing list and we'll let you know about that soon. All right, thank you again, Robert, for that great start. And with that, I am going to pass the presenter role now to our next panelist. I want to welcome Dr. Stephanie Malin. She is an environmental sociologist specializing in environmental and natural resource sociology, governance, and rural development, and she conducts community-based and mixed methods research focusing on the community impacts of resource extraction, energy production, and environmental deregulation. As an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Colorado State University, Stephanie is an award-winning teacher of undergraduate courses on environmental justice, water and society, and environmental sociology. And she is a Malin Foundation postdoctoral fellowship researcher. She did that at Brown University in 2013, and she did her PhD in sociology from Utah State University. Steph, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and as Robert said, thank you everyone for being here. I'm sure you're about webinared out, and I hope everyone is staying safe and feeling healthy and happy, so thank you for being here. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of these issues of building community trust in a way that looks at how you interact with communities when you're actually in these communities on the ground. And I'm coming from a place of having worked in communities as an environmental sociologist for since about 2005 is when I started graduate school at Utah State, another wonderful land-grant university. And I worked with the Western Rural Development Center as a graduate intern for about 5 years while I was there as well. So I've been working in communities that have extractive industries located in them. They're either hosting them currently or they have legacies of those industries. And I'll dig in a little bit to my research today as concrete examples. So communities that have unconventional oil and gas production going on, communities that have had uranium mining and milling and histories of those kinds of extractive activities. So to really start looking at how not to have kind of these equally extractive relationships in terms of the research that we do. I think that's really important for us to understand how to build relationships that are genuine and can kind of take a long time. But we will get to some of those. I'll get to some of those tips along the way. I wanted to give a little bit of background in environmental sociology because I think often people don't know what that is, and we all really should, instead of, in my biased opinion, right, instead of knowing what economics is, like the back of our hands, environmental sociology is becoming and has been incredibly relevant to the social, environmental, and biophysical issues that we're dealing with And we can see this quite a bit with the current coronavirus pandemic and some of the non-economic concerns that come in, but also the economic concerns. So as environmental sociologists, we pay attention to how the social and the biophysical interact with one another. We look at and we ask in a really broad sense, how do societies, economies, and institutions interact with the natural world? So one thing that's kind of a misnomer about sociology is that we focus on, and we focus on micro-level interactions, we do focus on social psychology a little bit, but primarily, especially for people like me who are studying political economy, we focus on institutions, we focus on agencies, we focus on regulation, and we focus on how these interact with the natural world. When you're looking at environmental sociology from an environmental justice and health lens, which is what I tend to do, we are also asking how resources, so the good things in society, such as public transportation, parks, quality air, quality water, right? How all those things, as well as the bad things, so toxicants in the environment, industrial sites, facilities that are high pollution facilities, for example, how are all those resources distributed within societies and across societies, right? So looking at issues of inequality and power and equity from an institutional and a sociological perspective. Another big part of this is who decides. So who has a seat at the table? And we'll talk a lot about this in terms of building relationships. Who decides zoning regulations? Who decides how we regulate different institutions and what institutions actually enforce regulations? And when we look at histories of environmental injustice, often entire swaths of people or groups have been excluded from making those decisions or having a seat at the table. So what does all that mean for power, for sustainability of the choices we make, and what is the institutional context? So those are some of the main driving questions that we ask as sociologists when we're going into communities. A little background on environmental justice. If that phrase is kind of nebulous or imprecise for people, I just wanted to provide a little working definition of what that lens means. And it means a variety of things, depending upon who you talk to. And very importantly, all those definitions can have equal legitimacy, right? But when I'm talking about it today, I'm looking at two specific aspects of environmental justice. One is distributive and one is procedural. So distributive is more like a snapshot of what's going on in terms of where those bad things and good things in society are. So where are the toxicants and hazards in our society? Where do we see cancer clusters emerging, right, from people who've been exposed to hazards in their environment for long periods of time? And on the other hand, where do we see people having more access to secure food systems, more access to those parks and those public transportation systems I was talking about? But procedural justice, right, the who decides, is also a key component of this, and it can often set up that kind of snapshot that we get of the distribution of goods and bads in society. So procedural justice is kind of the deeper component of environmental justice, about who decides how we zone, how we use land, how we use water, how we protect our relations and ecosystems and other species, right? And who has a seat at the table to do that? And often those are the deep-seated kind of struggles that we see when we're looking at environmental justice issues. The environment is also defined within environmental justice as inclusive of the built environment and inclusive of our communities, right? Often we picture environments as something that's kind of out there or something that's quote unquote natural and separate human activity from that. But we spend, most of us, about 90% of our time in the built environments, right? And so the environment is understood as anywhere where people live, work, play, or pray. That's kind of the catchphrase of the environmental justice movement. And just to give us a sense of that a little bit, the state of the research today shows, when we look at hundreds of studies that have been done by sociologists, by environmental health practitioners, public health, urban planning, a whole host of interdisciplinary kind of perspectives, we have found through hundreds of really rigorous scientific studies that in general, we see patterns in those distributive injustices and those procedural inequities I just talked about, specifically so that ethnic minorities, indigenous persons and communities, people of color, and low-income communities, so communities that have persistent poverty within them, they confront a higher burden of environmental exposures from a whole host of pollutants, air, water, and soil pollution, primarily from practices like industrialization, militarization, and consumer practices. And you'll see that study was, that quote comes from a kind of meta-analysis done about 11 years ago, but it's really capturing the state of the field from at that point. And we have subsequent studies that add to kind of that mountain of evidence about having some issues with environmental justice, particularly in industrial settings. Now, to take us to where I do some of my work in Colorado and in the American West, just to kind of ground us in what that looks like. Colorado has kind of been the epicenter of US energy production. There are other hotspots around the US and of course globally as well, but Colorado's interesting for these issues because we've hosted and continue to host quite a bit of mining, milling, and other extractive activities. We often try to entice waste storage activities into some of these communities that have had histories of extractive activities and they've gone bust. There's new development in oil and gas going on here as well, although some interesting economic developments with that recently. And we have other energy sectors that are also implicated, including coal, lots of renewable energy development as well, and other energy sectors that have been part of the US fabric of our economy, but also as we justly transition to other industries, we're seeing all of those kind of implicated. And the important thing here from an EJ or environmental justice perspective is that this can create sacrifice zones, right? This kind of extractive activity. Often companies that are private companies that are doing a lot of this activity don't necessarily have to put up a lot of bonds to clean up these sites. And so you can end up with sacrifice zones where people and places can be treated as expendable before and during and after the extractive activity takes place. So how do we start to build trust and connection? This is for community practitioners. I've worked a lot in community development, so not just economic development, but from that Western Rural Development Center perspective, kind of how we develop non-economic, all components of a community, and building that kind of meaningful connection, right, and not just swooping in. So I'll give us examples in oil and gas and uranium in a few minutes, but just in general, this takes a lot of time, right? The kind of a list of what we should do. Reciprocity, in my opinion, should really guide how we're working with communities. These are not just places where we can kind of hover in and take the information we need and then not give something back to the community. So the first thing that really is necessary, and this can often be the most challenging part, is the time that it takes to develop genuine relationships with a lot of people, to really understand the community that you're looking at and not just look at the power brokers or the gatekeepers in the community as the voice of that space, right? Recognizing there's a diversity of perspectives and it takes time to learn that and to build relationships. Really focusing on how you can involve community members at various stages of research in ways that also benefit the community are key to building trust, to building relationships, and to asking questions that are useful to the communities you work with. So that little acronym there just stands for Community-Based Participatory Action Research. It's a mouthful, but those principles in place are really kind of a roadmap to success. And there's a whole spectrum of tools that can be used from that perspective. But it's important to understand that, of course, we have various amounts of time, different funding levels, all the rest of it. But paying attention to the capacity you have to try to invite insights and participation from communities you work with along that spectrum at some place, right, or at some point along that spectrum can really help build trust and relationships. In my research, we've offered public check-ins, public meetings, presentations, and data sharing are some examples of ways to do that in a way that might be in the middle of the spectrum there, right? Not necessarily involving community members at every level of research, including developing questions and executing the research, but that's kind of a middle road way to do it. It's also really valuable to have community members that you've been working with, perhaps community partner organizations, that can check on your data and your findings, right? That you share an article or a book chapter or a vignette with before you publish, for example, or before that becomes a report through your organization. And do these findings resonate, right? So building space for that. Trying to avoid things like extracting information, treating communities or people instrumentally, asking questions or pursuing research that's of value only in your disciplines literature, right? In the kind of nerdy peer-reviewed articles that are very important but are not very accessible to a host of people, and asking questions that are of value only to certain research settings, to certain NGO agendas, right? Trying to avoid that sort of shallow research design. Also avoiding conducting research in fatigued spaces or communities, right? Places that have had a lot of research done in them already. They can feel really taken advantage of, and it's important to not overdo that. But this involves doing your homework, right? Knowing what's already been done, where it's been done, and again, what the community might need to enrich their own environmental justice experiences, or is help heal some of those relationships with extractive industries, or from extractive industries. So I often pull from a philosopher and scholar, Kristen Schrader-Frechette, who does a lot of work in environmental justice. I think it's very important, particularly given the issues that we're dealing with climate crisis, now with the pandemic, and with a lot of these issues having policy implications, that it's really important to be objective without being neutral, that we as scholars, as community practitioners, as members of NGOs, we're often speaking from a place of relative privilege, doing our work from a platform where we can speak for those who don't have those platforms to speak from. And again, keeping in mind that we can be objective about our scientific findings, we can still do rigorous science without being neutral. And my kind of mantra is that when the world's on fire, you help put out the fire, right? You don't stand there and count the flames to write your article, inform your NGO, or entice investors or funders. Those are important things, and they all matter for our daily jobs, but the bigger kind of ethic here is using that platform of privilege to advocate for more environmentally just scenarios for these communities that you're working with. So I will give a couple quick examples here. I know I only have a few minutes left of the work I do in Colorado and in the West. I've also done work around the Four Corners area. And when I was doing my postdoc at Brown from 2011 to 2013, I worked on unconventional oil and gas along the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania as well. This is an older map of Colorado oil and gas mega production that's going on to give you a sense of where it's happening. We see a lot of activity, and these blue dots are basically permits, well permits, in a state that now has about 60,000 operational wells and about 24 inspectors that are employed by the state to make sure that those 60,000 wells are operating within state regulations. So it gives you a sense of the scale just in one state, right? We have over 150,000 of these wells operating around the nation. This kind of drilling has made the US the #1 producer of hydrocarbons. Again, we know the economic picture right now is shakier, but this was kind of the boom that was driving this kind of production in a place like Colorado, where since 2010, oil extraction has quadrupled and natural gas extraction increased by 51%. Due largely to what we call unconventional technologies, right? So that combination of horizontal and vertical drilling, which we know colloquially, right, as hydraulic fracturing or fracking, is one component of that. And so I had participated in a study. I was the lead social scientist in the National Institutes of Health study that was funded to look at quality of life and stress. And this was because there's a growing body of evidence related to negative public health outcomes and vulnerable populations, that we were seeing really negative public health outcomes around oil and gas production, from increased birth defect rates to increased childhood cancers. And a lot of this research was done by other scientists on this study, Lisa McKenzie and John Adgate, who are public health and epidemiologist researchers. But one thing that wasn't being looked at was, what does it do to live in close proximity to this kind of oil and gas activity, right? Where you've got a lot of industrial activity in the middle of your neighborhood, often because of the way that zoning is done and decided, and people not having a seat at the table. So we were looking at whether or not this increases stress and how this impacts overall quality of life. So to do this, we really had to work. I had to design studies where we worked with community partners, we worked within communities, and we were not only answering the questions that were of interest to us as researchers, but also that could give back to neighborhoods and communities understanding what they were experiencing, right, collectively, and what was going on. And what we found is that using that kind of community engaged approach for over 3 to 4 years of the research study, that unconventional oil and gas production acts as a neighborhood industrial stressor that negatively affects people's reported mental health. So their levels of stress, their levels of depression go way up according to self-reported data. Because this kind of production near neighborhoods and these kinds of, and people's daily activities, right? So where they go to school, where they work, where they might go outside and try to get recreational activity, this is a chronic environmental stressor for them. And this means that people who live in these areas experience uncertainty and powerlessness. Institutional drivers, like the context of regulation, really leads to diminished mental health. And this can really enhance the power of the industry over decision making versus what people are able to execute or decide on their own, right? With having limited seats at the table, as it were. So to give you a sense of what we did to build trust in this research study, we had community partners who were involved from the beginning. We held multiple community meetings and had multi-sided presentations. So we'd take the data to the communities where we were doing surveys, where we were doing interviews. I've done over 100 interviews in different communities. And then we shared this data and this research along the way with these communities through those meetings. We pursued other grants that with community members that facilitated relationships, data sharing, and benefited communities ultimately, and designed additional research studies based on what communities needed from these findings. So I have another set of research I will not go into in depth to give us time for Q&A, but I've also done a lot of research in uranium production and legacies of injustice related to that. I'm continuing to do research, and I have a book I've written on that subject. So if anyone has questions on that, I'd be happy to answer questions on what we did to build trust within those communities. Just some photo voice, if you're familiar with that, people working in the community who take pictures and contribute to research studies this way, that shows a oil and gas produced water leak in a neighborhood with one of the women who is participating and taking photos about daily life impacts, just to give us a sense. But I'm happy to answer questions about the oil and gas or the uranium as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steph. I think that was a great add-on to what Robert shared, and I really appreciate your comments about ways to build trust from the very beginning of your research design. We have a lot of questions. We're going to get to as many as we possibly can. If you have a question for Robert and Steph, please go ahead and put that in your question box there, and we will get to as many as we can. With that, I want to invite both Robert and Steph, and we'll start with a question here. First, something that you both spoke to, and there you are, Steph, and Robert, I think, will be joining us. There we are. Wonderful. You both spoke to the importance of engagement. I think, Robert, you said it's really not about messaging. Your research showed, some interesting findings based on the survey data. It's not just going to be a messaging fix. It actually takes engagement. And Steph, you talked a little bit, I think you said reciprocity and actually taking the time. And so I want to ask a question on behalf of many people who are looking to work in communities that they don't necessarily come from. How do you get started? Is there a way to better understand your community, knowing that you might need to move there, you might need to have people there, they might need to start going to community meetings, but what's the best way to just maybe get a snapshot? Is there some sort of survey data? Is there some way to get a sense of your community before you dig in? And Robert, maybe we'll start with you, and then Steph would love to hear if you have any thoughts on that as well.
I mean, there's no question this is a challenge. When I was at Environmental Defense Fund, I used to do work across the country on conservation efforts with local ranchers, farmers, forest landowners. And when you show up and tell them I'm from Environmental Defense Fund from Washington, D.C., you don't always get the best immediate reaction. But I would say, I think to the extent you demonstrate that you care about what happens to local communities, that you've got skin in the game, that you're willing to put resources on the table to help people and to listen, I think those barriers actually drop pretty quickly. I think Steph emphasized this: you can't just show up and do research and not be engaged. And so I think that showing that you're engaged, that you care, that you've got skin in the game, I think that matters a lot.
Yeah, I would just echo in terms of many of the issues that at least social scientists and university researchers or extension agents, even NGOs who are connected to these issues are looking at, right? There's been previous research done on these issues and often the spaces that are kind of hotspots for the sort of questions you're asking. So making sure that you've done everything you can to find out what the background research is and to get your feet on the ground as much as possible. A lot of social science research especially relates to, and marketing research relates to only doing surveys, right? And while surveys can be really valuable tools for understanding, as Robert was showing, right, it really gives us a great sense of kind of the more collective set of opinions and insights into things. Having your feet on the ground and really trying to develop relationships is kind of that second step, right? After you've seen what's out there and what's been done. And people catch on to that right away, right? So if you are kind of wasting their time by asking questions that have already been asked and answered, I think people are less likely to give you more time, right? And it doesn't always mean that you can move there and you can be an ethnographer, right? That's not always possible, especially if you're working for an organization where you're doing multiple projects. But it's that good faith effort, as Robert was saying, right, to show up and to really be available. And some of this means, like in some areas, I still have relationships with folks I started interviewing and talking to in 2006 in some of these uranium communities that I'm still checking in with frequently and working with, right, and trying to advocate for in the policy arena. And that can be an incredible amount of time. So just understanding that before you get involved in this work, that's kind of the careful and responsible way to do it. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yes, there's no replacement for actually spending the time to do the work and to make those true relationships. One question, or a kind of a theme from a number of questions, is around this tie between the economic and sort of the environmental. And specifically, a few different people have questions around the value of the environment for sort of ecosystem services, and the idea that it's not always a trade-off, right? And sometimes it's very much the opposite, that keeping a safe environment and a healthy environment is actually better for the economic environment. I think Robert and Steffi both touched on this. Is there ways to make that case if that's not something that people necessarily always think right off the bat? Maybe Steph, we'll hear from you how you've kind of made that case between economic and environmental value, and then Robert would love to hear what you've learned from your research as well.
My answer is going to be quite critical, I would say, and I think it's really fitting with what we're seeing right now with some of these discussions we're having about perhaps privileging a market system or the economy over people's health and well-being. We're seeing that everyone kind of grappling with those questions. And a big part of what I teach, a big part of what I research relates to the fact that we, especially in places like the United States and in other spaces in the global north, and we're seeing this spread throughout the global south, there's this preference since the 1980s for what's called neoliberal economic policies, right? And that's a fancy way of describing really market-centered, deregulated economic systems that privilege privatization of public goods over communal management, and where we see corporate culture really kind of dominating a lot of other institutional culture. And really, we've internalized this, a lot of us, right? And we think about the well-being of the market before we think about the well-being of ourselves. And part of it is survival, right? We don't have a lot of safety nets to rely on in a place like the United States, particularly because of these neoliberal policies that strip away the power of the state to provide safety nets. And rural communities, as Robert talked about, right, this is often the space where we see kind of the greatest skepticism towards regulation and towards the federal state in particular. But part of this is because these are some of the places where we've seen safety nets and the lack of them have some of the biggest impacts in terms of persistent poverty. So I think we're at a point where we really need to start deconstructing some of those ideas of the economy that we've internalized that are deeply ingrained in, for example, the American worldview, right, about individualism and being able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I highly recommend, for those of you that are interested in this, looking at a book by an economist from Oxford whose name is Kate Raworth. Her book is Donut Economics, and it's 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. It's exceptionally engaging, And cities are, and state and other nations are adopting this framework because it's so pliable and malleable. So for example, Amsterdam, it's a very kind of liberal example or progressive example. They're using the donut model to recover from coronavirus economic impacts. It's just a different way of thinking about how we can build criteria that include the market, but also include the commons, households, and the state as players in how we build these relationships and move forward.
Robert, thank you for that, Steph. Robert, any thoughts for you? Any kind of research that you've done around how people think about ecosystem services or sort of the positive relationship between environmental health and economic health?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I mentioned this, I think I was surprised in our rural attitudes research that the vast majority of the people we talked to already got it. They already got that the two things were linked, that you needed a clean environment for a good economy, vice versa. And I've spent a ton of my career. I started off at Environmental Defense Fund working on incentives for endangered species. And for years, I thought I was in the incentive business. I thought my job was to create incentives so that landowners would have an economic incentive to manage their lands in ways to restore habitat, protect species, restore clean water, ecosystems, all that stuff. And the farther I get away from it, the more I realize, yeah, I was in the incentive business. Incentives matter a lot, but I was also in the collaboration business. And by that, I mean that the relationships mattered a lot, that if all you have is the incentives and you don't have good information, you don't have a relationship, it's much harder to succeed. And so this is, I think, part to support some of what Steph just said, which is to say economics matters, of course. But I think we've undervalued in a lot of places collaboration, relationship, all those things that matter a lot too to getting stuff done on the ground. Yes,
there's no way to replace that. That's helpful, and I think especially helpful when you talked a little bit about that people already get it. A few questions. Robert, you mentioned that you worked on endangered species and a few other things earlier in your career. Do you have much evidence of what people think about things like the Endangered Species Act in rural communities? We have a few questions about that specifically, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. And then, Steph, Shirley, if you have anything to add based on your work, we'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, so we asked about specific policies, and it's interesting. You get there's a sense people understand the importance of endangered species, the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water and Clean Water Act, and those types of things. And so there's almost a bit of a paradox, which is people recognize the importance of the resources, but at the same time, they're highly distrustful of the government and the ability of the government to get things done. Not everybody, but it's and anybody who's spent time working with rural constituencies, it's always lurking in the background. I mean, one of the things that got me interested in this, I worked on when I was at USDA. I did the public meetings on Bears Ears. I did lots of stuff on WOTUS. I did lots of climate change stuff. And if you poll in rural, all these things poll well. Do you want to protect Bears Ears? Of course, we love Bears Ears. Great. You want to protect clean water? Of course. It's the second set of questions. It's the how. It's the who does it. It's the feds versus the state, where you see a real divergence. And I think, my hope is if we're all aware of that and aware of those dynamics, then maybe we can develop some approaches that actually begin to build trust.
Yeah, I can just add briefly to that. I think I work a lot in areas of water management, and as you can imagine, that's one of the most contentious issues. I would recommend a book by David Freeman, who's a sociologist who looked at the South Platte River and how kind of building these working groups and consensus-based working groups around how to work with the Endangered Species Act, right, along the South Platte River, but still allow people to have some economic security, right, and to have other interests and other concerns really included in how that was actually enforced and regulated in those areas. The book is a great example of how you might do that within the realm of water. But more broadly, I think water, as well as sage grouse management and many of these land use management kind of issues, right, we can see a history of success in some of these spaces when you create that thick democracy at kind of these mid-level areas, right? Or these mid-level kind of scales, as sociologists would talk about it, where you bring a lot, you have this table, right, to have discussions, and you have meetings to have discussions about how a huge swath of stakeholders view the issue. And again, these can take years to develop. If you look at the sage grouse working groups, for example, they have been working for decades, and so have some of these water groups, and the Colorado Water Plan and how that was executed is a great example of this. They're not perfect, but they provide spaces in which stakeholders actually can talk to each other, can look at each other, and can realize what are the kind of the complementary areas where we overlap on things like the Endangered Species Act, or like water conservation, or how we distribute things like water, right? These really scarce, important resources. So I am a huge advocate for kind of combating that distrust in the federal government by creating spaces for interaction and relationship building that are not at that macro level scale, right? But that bring it down to regions and to communities where people can actually see other human beings that are involved in this, and they have a strong record of success, I would argue.
That's great. And I think we all, especially these last 2 months, if we didn't value human connection before, we certainly do now. One, I think, last question that we'll have time for today. A few people are asking about sources of information. And I think, Robert, you touched on this a little bit about trust and the sources of information and stuff. I imagine you've dealt with this a lot as well. You know, given that not everyone has the same trust in the federal government or in certain organizations, environmental organizations, et cetera, you know, if you're trying to provide information to a community about something that's happening there locally, you know, where is a good place to start? Do you try to give multiple sources? Are there, you know, ways to think about framing something that you know that the organization you cite will have some resonance with who you're talking to? Robert, maybe with you, and then Steph, very briefly before we have to wrap.
Yeah, so I mentioned that, you know, in our research, there's sort of this gap between a desire for really good science and information, but not understanding where to get it. I've been struck by the COVID-19 stuff we're going through right now, is that there's actually not that much polarization of how people think about kind of the science around this stuff, the flattening the curve, the mass. It's actually not that polarized across both rural, urban, as well as Democrat and Republican. And I think people have the ability, have the ability right now, because they're super interested for obvious reasons. They can access Dr. Fauci. They can access some of that information. Climate is, of course, very, very important, but it maybe doesn't have the sense of urgency. And the question for all of us is, how do we deliver that science in an unbiased way? I think messengers are going to be really important. I work for EDF, but I think the science comes from the EDFs of the world. It's not as valuable. How can we work with community colleges? How can we work with land grant universities? How can we work with extension people? How can we work through historically Black universities and colleges, tribal colleges, and others to create avenues for that information to flow in an unbiased way through messengers that people trust?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. Very briefly, Robert, I completely agree with you. I think one thing that we've done with our oil and gas community partners too, and other grants that we got, was try to really dig into where can they access information, where are they having barriers to accessing good information, and then trying to build websites that everyone can access that gets them through those $40 an article paywalls, for example, to get to peer-reviewed journals, and that really creates kind of a trusted clearinghouse of information, right? We're trying to figure out how to do this with the Center for Environmental Justice at CSU, for example. How do you start to create spaces that are trusted, right, that use the platform you have to help make that information accessible to everyone? I think it's really important in terms of media access to re-educate a lot of Americans on what the viable media sources are and where the funding comes from. And since we're social media and other media sources have kind of taken over, and we're all using a lot of opinion-based stuff to argue with each other rather than science-based, which is dangerous, as we can see. The other thing is, it's up to scientists to translate our information in a public setting, right? So the Conversation is a wonderful outlet of 1,000-word articles that everyone can subscribe to, where scientists are describing issues in really digestible, in a really digestible fashion. And this lets us take the science that we're doing and make it accessible to everyone, and then link to other news and other research that's been done if people want more information. So it's also on the scientists and across the board, social scientists, natural scientists, et cetera, to make our research publicly available.
Thank you so much for that. And I do want to let everyone know we will make sure to link to all of these resources that we've mentioned and books that we've mentioned in the email. That unfortunately is all the time we have for today. I do want to let you know there's an upcoming webinar scheduled for June 3rd where we'll talk about 30 by 30, half Earth, and other ideas for land conservation at scale. We have some great panelists, so please sign up for that if you're interested in that great topic. And I really just want to thank our panelists from today. Robert and Steph, you were so great. You offered so much great insight into rural communities, into working in diverse communities, building trust, and I know that it was just a pleasure to talk to you both today. I wish you the best, and I wish everyone health and safety right now, and thank you for joining us. Robert and Steph, have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.